3. Jasmine in the garden. The cold night air hit Charlotte like an icy wall, but it didn't bother her. She welcomed it. She welcomed the heavy damp mist on her cheeks, felt its frozen touch on her skin, anything to blot out Derek, to wash away the memory of his breath on her face, the pungent smell of man and brandy. Damn Derek and damn marriage. Her mind reeled at the gloomy future that lay ahead of her. She gazed into the fog-shrouded darkness and saw her own life unfold, stultifying, endless days spent as Lady Galway, forever under the cold, critical eye of her husband. And the nights? Charlotte shuddered to think of the nights. She had seen something in Derek that had chilled her to her soul. Something desperate and unnatural that lurked beneath the beautiful facade. A shiver ran through her, a warning of some danger she could not identify. Charlotte braced herself against the cold and ran farther out onto the expansive length of the marble terrace. She could feel the salt spray as a fine, gusting drizzle lashed out unexpectedly, temporarily veiling her view of the adjoining gardens below. Facing southeast, the rear of the manor house was typical of so many others in Cornwall. Sheltered by a low hill and a belt of trees, the gardens provided sanctuary from the lunatic vagaries of Cornish weather and were blessed with temperate enough climate to nurture growth year-round. One could find primroses on a morning in January, camellias and rhododendron coming out into bud and bloom in early February. This was the peculiar reward for living in such a bitter and unforgiving land. Now, on a cold winter's eve, Charlotte looked down at the distant orchard of winter apples, which would be harvested as late as Michaelmas. Her father had personally supervised the restoration of the gardens, and through the layers of mist, Charlotte could see the graceful arc of trellises leading down the divergent paths. The first garden exemplified the extravagance necessary for a gentleman farmer, proudly displaying Cornwall's topiary masterpieces. Splendid hedges were carved into geometric configurations, elderberry trees trimmed into perfect harmonious spheres, concoctions of ivy painstakingly contorted into animals and ogres. But it was the ancient, unkempt rose garden that beckoned to Charlotte. She felt the icy moisture seep in through her flimsy slippers, the wet marble slipping like glass beneath the paper-thin soles. Mrs. Givens would certainly give her a tongue-lashing tonight. But she didn't care, any more than the damp tendril of hair that slipped from a comb like a sodden rope of gold. All of Mrs. Givens' efforts of turning her into a proper lady were so much nonsense anyway. Charlotte heard the faint clatter of tortoise shell against stone, and wearily sank to her knees. She looked in vain for the comb amongst the skittering leaves. The wet, earthy smell was comforting, something real and tangible. This is what life is about, she thought, not some silly party. Charlotte pressed the leaves to her face before she let them spill through her fingers. How could her father ask such a thing? How could she go through with it? She positioned herself against the massive balustrade as she watched couples step from the stone doorway onto the balcony. Their ebony silhouettes, flat and well-defined, looked as if they had been cut from black paper. Nearby, she heard a low masculine voice, answered by a woman's provocative laughter, intimate whispers muffled by the thick night air. Charlotte listened, hypnotized by the intimate murmurs of the lovers. With Derek, could she force herself to play in such a grotesque farce? She had to still a shiver of disgust as she thought of his insinuating gaze, his punishing, hungry touch. No, this was too much. Her eyes involuntarily swept to a dimly lit corner and saw the couple locked in a tight embrace. He was an army officer wearing the unmistakable kilt of the Highlander, a dark grey and green plaid shot through with vivid streaks of red. A broad, curved back encased in blood-red wool swept across the powerful shoulders as his arms encircled the woman with crushing intensity. The brilliant red gaiters set off startling pale contours of thighs, sinewed and naked as they obscenely pressed into the folds of the luxuriant ball gown. The woman's body arched backwards, the planes of her face all but hidden in darkness. Heavy chestnut curls tumbled over his hands as the emerald green of her eyes glinted like a prism. Charlotte could hear her own voice, disembodied and toneless. "Lydia." Lydia's dreamy eyes suddenly focused on Charlotte in recognition. Following her gaze, the Highlander turned angrily, impaling Charlotte with a ferocious, accusing stare. "And what are ye looking at?" he growled. Wordlessly, Charlotte backed away. She ran down the marble steps, down into the gardens below. She would be safe there. Safe as she had always been as a child so many years ago. Charlotte ran until her feet slid into the grassy earth of the overgrown trail. She could barely see the rows of spiky stumps, though. Within a few short weeks they would burst with a profusion of blossoms. This was a world that demanded nothing. A world where she would never grow up. She quickened her pace until she finally reached her destination. Graceful, dilapidated, the old gazebo was her special sanctuary, and inside it was as dark and intimate as a velvet-lined box. Only the elegant latticework was thrown into high relief by the intense glow from the mansion, casting glittering shards of light onto the rough floor. Charlotte stumbled onto the wooden bench, worn smooth with age. She loved the heavy overgrowth of exotic Arabian jasmine that blanketed the walls. She could not see it tonight, but the perfume was intoxicating. Her father had brought back the tiny bushback with him from Africa years ago, and now the tiny star-shaped blossoms seemed to bloom earlier every year. She inhaled deeply, her lungs straining against whalebone, begging for more of the delicious elixir, flowing through her limbs with a flooding warmth. Charlotte sat with a satisfying thump, her skirt spreading out about her in a huge satin pool. She lay back and closed her eyes as images swirled through her mind. She saw the dusty roads, camels laden with the heavy fruit of the date palm, bazaars filled with the throngs of mahogany-skinned vendors plying their wares of copper and spices, their voices weaving a haunting melody of antiquity. How she longed for those days and the comfort of her only true friend. He would know what to do. He always did. She was transfixed by the heavy stillness. Was it a second or an eternity? How long she did not know. No sound broke the silence that enfolded the little gazebo, save the rustling of the ivy, and yet the air stirred as if a spirit had entered the small building. She could feel it. Charlotte blinked, then blinked again. Was it possible that the darkness had just grown darker? It was as if some cloak had blotted out the moon. She tried to differentiate the shadows that surrounded her. The delicate ivy, the dancing diamond latticework, the barely discernible outline of a man. He stood quietly in the shadowed depths of the doorway. The fact that his body blocked nearly every ray of light meant that he was tall. The fact that she could barely see him meant that he wore black. With a terrified gasp, she bolted off the bench, and in one terrible jerk, the French heel of her slipper snagged the delicate hem. She fell into the copious billow of gown and petticoats. Large hands closed firmly around her arms and lifted her effortlessly. She flinched at the rough scrape of callus against her bare skin as powerful fingers pushed aside the flimsy satin sleeves. She could feel her bodice slip as the steely grip compressed her shoulders back. Indignantly, she wrenched free with a determined jerk, her voice gasping. "Thank you, sir, but I'm perfectly capable of—" Charlotte froze in mid-sentence. She was looking into the face of a demon. An unruly mane of hair glinted in the darkness, partially concealing the brutal outline of forehead and cheek. Tossed artlessly over massive shoulders, they stood so close that Charlotte could feel the long, heavy tendrils brush her own face. The expensive wingtip collar and elegant foulard, meticulously knotted at his throat, only accentuated the bronze skin, the exotic tilt of black eyes that burned hers even within the frigid clasp of a winter night. But it was the scar. It eclipsed his face, running in a jagged line down his left cheek, the violence of the wound as tangible as a razor. Instinctively, Charlotte cringed with revulsion. She felt his breath catch, the almost imperceptible flinch of his fingers, as if he had been dealt a blow. The man stepped back, well away from her. His body was haloed in the moonlight. Powerfully moulded in the tailored evening coat, it was clear that the breadth of shoulder and sinewy frame did not attest to the gentlemanly comforts of the English manner. This was a man she had never encountered before, someone clearly beyond civilization's bounds, and the realization swept an icy chill down her spine. "1,000 pardons, miss. I have frightened you." The voice was surprisingly soft and flowed through the darkness with the intoxicating warmth of a fine wine. It stroked her with the same calming reassurance that would soothe the startled beast. Charlotte stiffened angrily. His voice was too insolent, too sure. "On the contrary, sir, I was not in the least bit frightened. If indeed you are a gentleman, then I have nothing to fear." Charlotte's voice echoed into the night air as she furiously waited for his response. But none came. She straightened, her head high, impatient. "You are a gentleman, are you not?" The stranger's eyes were hooded in shadow, but she could see a faint smile curl his lips. He seemed to scrutinize her with the same predatory amusement that a cat might have with a mouse. "Am I a gentleman?" The air bristled with silence. Then he suddenly laughed, his voice sharp and robust. "By God, could such a thing be possible?" He stepped closer, the sharp contours of his face suddenly thrown into high relief in the moonlight, eyes gleaming like burning embers as he stood over her. "You fancy you would be safer with a gentleman?" His voice ground to a husky breath. "By my troth, mademoiselle, looking at you right now, any man, gentle or no, would have only one thing in mind." White heat coursed through Charlotte's veins with a surprising jolt. She didn't like this sensation of frailty, nor the unaccountable quaver in her voice. "And what would that be?" His eyes answered her only too well. They glittered darkly, raking her with slow speculation. His gaze dropped to well below her collarbone. His bold scrutiny was beyond unsettling. Self-consciously, a protective hand fluttered to her bodice, captivating his dark gaze like a beacon, and grazed a bare breast. The flimsy satin sleeves had melted down her arms, pulling at the resolute whalebone of her corset, and peaking high over the heavy muslin shelf, rested upon those same pale contours, the distinctive crest of rosy nipples. Charlotte gasped with horror before a wave of heat swept from bosom to cheek. With a dismayed squeal, she smashed her hands over her chest and whirled about. Frantically, she pushed her bosom back into the confines of her corset, while simultaneously pulling the slippery bodice back into place. She only prayed to God that the ground would swallow her up at that very second. However, she didn't get the answer that she prayed for. From behind, the throaty laugh, fiendish and mocking, reverberated unmercifully in the small gazebo. The humiliation was already excruciating, but this was too much. Charlotte wheeled about as she yanked up a sleeve. "No, you are certainly no gentleman. You are an ogre and a boor. You... She had stepped fully into the stranger. He wasn't laughing any more. Her breasts brushed the heavy brocade of his vest. Slowly, painfully, she looked up. He hovered over her, as if he would engulf her very being. "And you, my beautiful young woman, you are lucky that it was I and not some other man in the darkness. Rest assured, he would have taken what was so generously offered. And, by Allah, I wonder myself." His voice faltered as his gaze swept over her. His eyes were unfathomable. "What the devil is going on here?" The snarl of outrage buffeted the exterior of the tiny gazebo with the force of a gale. Charlotte didn't have to look to know who it was. He stood in the doorway, his silver-white hair almost translucent in the moonlight, his fists clenched with rage. Her eyes sought Derek's, but his gaze was already locked on to the demon that stood over her. She shrank back to see the stranger's shoulders flex with tension. The bronze jaw clenched as it turned to the direction of Derek, in direct challenge. This was all she needed, a brawl. Charlotte swept into the doorway with proprietary calm. She was on Earnshaw. She could handle this. She refused to endure a jealous confrontation. Derek bristled before her. She took a deep breath before she made her best attempt to sound dismissive. "Good evening, Derek. I didn't know you had such a fondness for gardens." He glared at her. "I can hardly announce my betrothal without a fiancé, can I?" he seethed. "I tore these grounds apart looking for you, and this is what I find." He hitched his jaw at the stranger with a violent jerk. His voice lowered to a hiss. "Would you humiliate me before the entire county?" Derek's anger was palpable. Charlotte hoped her voice would not betray the vague wave of fear that enveloped her. "I would say it is hardly necessary. You can do that very well on your own." Even in the darkness, she could feel the heat of Derek's rage. Within a step, he was upon her, his hand snaking around her waist with a violent jerk. "If you think you will go unpunished—" "Unhand the lady." The voice was so low that it could have been mistaken for distant thunder. He moved into Derek's path, standing before him like a stone wall, cold and silent, ominously silent. No other man had equaled Derek in ferocity until now. Something flickered in Derek's eyes. Contemptuously he dropped Charlotte's hand. His gaze raked the stranger, then Charlotte in a censorious glare. "And what is this?" he glowered. "I leave you unattended for 5 minutes and you are cavorting with a stranger." The interloper stood impassively, yet the space around him seemed to stir a dark storm ready to lash out. Instinctively, Derek stepped back. The voice was soft, yet menacing. "The lady fell. I was assisting her. More like you were compromising her honor." "Derek!" Horrified, Charlotte pushed herself between the two titans. Derek thrust her aside with a disdainful hand, then glanced down at her with possessive authority. "You stay out of this, Charlotte." "I shall do no such thing. The gentleman was coming to my aid." Charlotte watched powerlessly as Derek advanced on the stranger. "You are the interloper, sir. I must ask you to remove yourself." Derek's velvet-clad shoulders tensed for combat. Instead, the stranger pushed past him, striding to Charlotte. Without ceremony, he pulled her into the archway and fully into the glow of moonlight, his hands fashioning around her shoulders in a sudden, intimate caress. He looked down at her with curious, marvelling eyes. "Charlotte Earnshaw?" His voice rang hollow, incredulous. His eyes devoured her, hands clutching in a trance-like rapture. Charlotte's mouth opened, but she could not speak. "Stand aside, sir!" Charlotte's trance was shattered by Derek's howl of outrage. She saw him charge like some mad bull, saw his fist lash out at the stranger's head before she was knocked to the ground. Enough is enough. Charlotte pulled herself from the dreadful Malay and ran from the gazebo. Let them kill each other.